Thank you to Councillor Jonathan Scott from Bradford East-Gwillimbury. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I always am afraid I get Gwillimbury wrong in my
You got
pronunciation.
West wrong. We're East-Gwillimbury is those other guys.
Fair enough. My apologies. But thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. We You reached out to me and we're kind of going back and forth a bit, and then boom, provincial election happens, and I think it just kind of contextually we kind of realized let's talk about the municipal governments, what you guys are needing from the province. Um, I'm going to throw it up to you and maybe just kind of lay down, like, as a counselor for a modestly sized municipality in the 905, like what do you want to hear from the Liberals, the NDP, the Progressive Conservatives, and the Green parties as you're paying attention to this campaign?
Yeah, I've been thinking about just how all the levels of government, provincially, federally, of course, even internationally, with Trump's threat of tariffs, seem to be in a state of
Mhm.
flux or managed chaos. Pick your description. Meanwhile, municipalities have to keep collecting the trash, clearing the snow, filling in the potholes, and doing those basics that people rely on every day. So when I'm looking at this provincial election in particular, I think everything of note that the main party leaders seem to be talking about in one way or another flows through town hall, whether that's in the last election, Premier Ford or PC leader Ford, now that the election's called, ran on get it done. Most of those projects were infrastructure projects that had a very close partnership with municipalities. Doug Ford was the city councillor. He ran for mayor of Toronto. Bonnie Crombie was the mayor of the city of Mississauga, the third largest in the province. And she's spoken about a new deal for cities and having 21st century ways to fund municipalities rather than just 19th century tools like the property tax. And Marit Stiles, I'd say, the least experienced, the least well known of the three leaders. Perhaps that's my bias showing, but she was a school board trustee and a union PR flack. So I'm less clear on what she stands for. She gave a kind of grab bag speech at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario last summer, but certainly was trying to say the right things, the devil being in the details. But I think the main thing, to put a button on it, that municipalities need at Queen's Park as a partner. So much of what residents desire from town hall requires provincial and federal funding, and especially provincial regulatory and legislative permission. And more often than not, we're in this tension between improve my quality of life and keep my cost of living affordable. And the way to do that at the local level is to be in partnership with the feds and the province to get the bigger revenue sources that they have to fund our projects. And the way it's working right now simply isn't working very well.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because a theme that we constantly come back to on this podcast is the affordability, particularly when it comes in relation to housing,
Right.
rentals, and whatnot. And I'm getting the sense, I, just full disclosure, we're recording this at the very start of this campaign. Um, so things might change by the time it does go to air. But I'm getting the sense right now that no one's talking about housing anymore. And I want to even brought it up, like, even on the national level. Like, that was the biggest crisis we were facing, is the affordability in terms of housing, rental prices, rent controls. All that was just kind of seemed a mess. And it was a big contributor to the rising costs of living for everyone. And now we're in an election, and we have a province that we are the lowest housing starts in Confederation across the province. Yet no one is really stepping up to the microphone to say this needs to be fixed. We need, and as you said, uh, municipalities are being demanded. You guys build the housing, yet you have very limited financial resources and very limited legislative resources to get it done. I want your comment on that. That it was 6 months ago. This was all we're talking about: housing, 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 and now we're in the election and nobody's talking about it. I want your comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think we'll remain. We'll have to see what comes forward. I mean, I liked some of the moves that the Ford government was making. I would say they were putting funding in place for the infrastructure that enables municipalities to let developers build housing, because for the most part, it's the private sector that builds housing in this province. And we could talk about whether there's more of a role for the public sector to build deeply affordable and social housing. But I think the average person, the average middle class person, when they're talking about a home, they're buying it. They're not they're not looking for a subsidized home. So the Ford government did put in place some good funding programs. The better, I forget what the full acronym was, but it spells out BFF in acronym, which was a cute pun. But that wasn't bad. They did, however, give municipalities a bit of whiplash with some of the Planning Act changes, where I had one proposed development that went through 3 different provincial processes, and every time we got it close to the finish line, the provincial process changed. So that was quite frustrating. And I think I said it in another venue that I wish Paul Calandra had have listened to the mantra of measure twice, cut once. Bonnie Crombie had a great housing plan last year, and I think the Liberal leadership race between her and Nate Erskine-Smith really had a real focus on housing affordability as this generation's main affordability challenge. I like her idea of scaling back or even removing development charges and replacing that with a provincial fund to municipalities. That would presumably save about $170,000 on the price of a home. But then there's other pieces there. I think all parties broadly agree in general. It's a question of the specifics on how you legalize people's right to build what they need to build or want to build on their own land. And so in Bradford, we're going through a variety of different measures. We've tried to incentivize getting retirement homes and have had some success, but that's a bit more of the upper middle class to upper income level that can access that product. We just opened a new county rent geared to income housing project. We have condos and apartments to bring that gentle density, as well as townhouses and bungalow semis and detached homes that we're trying to get into our mix. But it takes this all of the above approach that requires provincial funding, because municipalities next door to us don't have the water and sewage capacity that they need. So it's a real mixed bag out there, but there is no easy solution to this problem. It took us 30 years to sort of not build our way into this crisis, and we're not going to be able to get out of it in less than a decade, but it takes kind of doing a bit of everything aggressively.
What, having been at the table for some time now, I'm curious to know, like, what do you, as a counselor, or I guess I'm going to ask you to speak maybe for your fellow counselors on this one, but what are you guys looking for to say, I really wish we were able to just do this. We want to be able to make this decision, and we want to have the financial resources to make it happen, to get things like this project done, or to, because we've talked to a number of mayors, and they're just like, we're not able to do that. We're stuck in this, as you said, the development charge, a Ponzi scheme of just right. Like we need to build that next subdivision to pay for the last one that we just built. And I've heard every municipality or every mayor that we've talked to said that's the way it is. That's the system. And I'm wondering, like, if you had to sit down with all the party leaders, said which one of you is going to agree to X, Y, and Z, what would be X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, there's that great scene in the movie Babe about the talking pig, where the talking duck says, "The way things are stinks," and that's, I think about that a lot in municipal politics in general. But I don't have an easy answer for that, because it is such an all of the above strategy. I mean, we worked really closely with a condo developer who's in the ground now, first major condo in my downtown core, which is going to really help transform as we also do some upgrades to the streetscape to make it a beautiful main street. And I love the Jane Jacobs line that you can't just bring people to the downtown business district, you have to put them there. But we could use more of everything. When we toured, my deputy mayor and I toured this county housing facility, 50 beautiful units, and the program director from the county said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I'd like another 10." And yet it took us 5 years to get this one. So it's we need more of everything. And the province has a real role to play. Interest rates at the federal Bank of Canada level have a real role to play. And when I talk to developers, we try and have a good dynamic where I've had a lot of infill representing the older end of Bradford West-Gwillimbury, and I'll work with the neighboring residents to say, what are your must-haves? Because I'll take that to the developer and say, can we find a way to tweak this just a bit? I'm not here to block housing. I want housing built. But can we do it in a way that's sympathetic with the neighbors so we take the temperature down and don't have that NIMBY backlash? And for the most part, it's kind of worked out. But the trick is we need more of everything faster. And in my municipality, we're fortunate because we have the water and sewage capacity for the foreseeable future. But we're still not hitting our provincial housing targets. We might come closer this year if all things go according to plan, but it's still a 2 years we missed the target, and yet we are one of the fastest growing municipalities in the country. So this is a really thorny issue to try and solve.
Okay, so you brought up that you missed your targets. Explain to listeners why that is, because right now, if you listen to the federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, you're a gatekeeper, and you're just making good developers jump through unnecessary hoops and hurdles to build homes. Everything's on you. You're the fault. You're the blame.
Yeah.
So I want to know. I want to know what is going on here with not reaching the targets.
Well, I mean, it's a good piece of rhetoric. In my, I think it's also true. Sometimes there are municipal councillors who view their job as pandering and even dining out on residents' concerns. That's not my approach. I'm also, for about a week now, the chair of the Conservation Authority, and we're working really diligently to streamline processes, do the reviews that we have to do under law to protect people and property, but do it in a customer service focused way. I work incredibly well with developers, and I don't do it where I there are some politicians, even perhaps on my council, who say, whatever you need, come to town. And then there's others who say, hell no, never going to happen. I try and take the approach of, it's a good product. What changes can we make to make the residents happy and get to a place where everyone is 60, 70, 80% content, and we build the housing. And that approach has actually served me pretty well so far. I mean, municipalities have a role to play in reviewing development applications. There have been some crazy things proposed. We shouldn't have a role to block good proposals. And the devil's in the details on how you sort that out. But I think for the most part, the aim should be to get a developer a product that is financeable and marketable, and get the neighboring residents, when it's infill, a sense that they were heard. I have a controversial development that's likely to come forward for final approval or rejection in the next month on an older golf course. It's surrounded by subdivisions, but one of the subdivisions is an estate home. The residents have said some pretty simple things. Put a trail between my backyard and the new backyard, so I have a bit of a buffer. I'd like a school. I'd like more green space and parkland. The developer, to my sense, has done a lot of those things. And now the question is, do we bank those concessions, or do we say no, go to the Ontario Land Tribunal, lose, and the developer will do whatever he wants? So part of it is just explaining the framework we operate into residents to say, if I fight this, I'm blocking housing, but I'm also going to get overturned on appeal to the OLT. The real way to do it is to treat it like a negotiation and say to the developer, here are the must-haves that the residents have asked for. Where can we make a deal? And, developers are deal makers at heart, so they actually don't mind a bit of that engagement.
You brought up the OLT, and that I'm going to jump ahead to another question I had is, what's your opinion on the OLT? Something that we've kind of come around to on this podcast is just, it seems to be unnecessary in the grand scheme of things. People expect you as the city council, as the municipal government, to kind of say, this is how we want to build our community through official planning, and basically you approve, yep, this building is safe to build, meets code, go ahead and build it. And our sense is, over time, the OLT has kind of turned into a get out of jail card a bit. The idea is that if I'm a developer and I say, well, I want to add 10 more stories onto my building, I put it into you. I know I'm over the official plan limit. You say, well, no, reject. I'm going to the OLT, and we have a big fight. 10 years later, the OLT basically just says, yeah, okay, you get your 10 stories. You're out millions of dollars in legal fees, and the developer just recoups that in a higher per unit sale cost to to individuals. Are we is our impression overstated, or is there something that we're missing? And is it something that do you think we need the OLT in Ontario, or would you rather just have the final say be at the municipal government level?
Yeah, I mean, the example you just gave reminded me of the condo we have in Bradford. It is, I think, 2 stories above the official plan limit. And so we reached a community benefits agreement. He helped build a park and he contributed $1.5 million to build future affordable housing. I'd love a couple more stories than the official plan permits, and I'm $1.5 million better after that deal with a new park. So that's what I mean by try and make a deal rather than going to the OLT. Maybe it's my academic background's in law, so maybe it's the lawyer in me. I do think municipalities should be subject to judicial review, whether that's the Land Tribunal, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, what have you. I think all levels of government deserve to be scrutinized by the judicial system at a certain point. I mean, municipalities are creatures of the province. We don't have parliamentary sovereignty the way the federal or provincial parliaments do. So I think there's always a role to play, but I do think the OLT ought to be not only streamlined, but have a clearer policy direction to say sensible housing ought to be built. And the deck feels like it's now swung, or I'm going to mix the metaphor, but the deck has been swung back towards being pro development, whereas I think before it was a little bit pro community consultation. And I think getting the balance right is the tricky piece, but I do think municipalities at the end of the day, there are some municipalities that do crazy things, and residents and businesses should have the right to take that to court.
I I wouldn't object to that. I mean, I think that's what the courts are there for, is to kind of be that leveler of government overreach or injustice. I guess my concern is the OLT is this unwieldy sledgehammer when sometimes a scalpel is needed
Sure.
to get those fine details, and it becomes an all or nothing proposition in some cases. And I always thought, like, what's the point of having an official plan if at any point you can go to this extrajudicial body and they can basically say, yeah, it doesn't matter what the official plan is. You want 10 more stories? We'll let you do 8 or whatever have you. Um, and I always question if a citizen wants to say, oh, the municipal government is not following through on their plan or whatnot, you should be able to take them to court and sue them for, the municipality has violated that, their official plan or whatever have you. I guess my question is always like, we need the buck stops here. And the question I always have is, in development, where does the buck stop? Because it always seems that the municipalities come up with an official plan, but at some point it can be overridden and we get another 10-year process of just, let's, I guess my question is, like, we need to light a fire now underneath developers or municipalities' butts to say, get it built. And this is a long way of just saying, like, do we, has this body kind of turned against what it was intended for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth to that, but I also think official plans, they're a bit like pie crust, where you have to be able to break them to get at them, because sometimes you haven't thought of something that comes forward, and it's a
Mm.
really good idea. Before I was on council, my dad's a local minister. The church is outside of where the official plan is, but the council granted essentially an exemption and rezoned the property. A decade later, that was where one of the first retirement homes in town was built again, not where the official plan contemplated it, but it was the only affordable piece of land that a developer had at the
Mhm.
time. So there has to be, I think, to your point, an inherent amount of flexibility. And I think some municipalities, myself included, actually, our municipality has a bit of an attitude of the 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 specter of an OLT appeal sort of forces us to stay up the drawing board a little longer and see, can we get to a place where we can reach consensus and have a deal. Otherwise, we are going to be overturned on an appeal, and we don't want that to happen or incur the cost.
I understand that. I see your point. it's one of those things that, this is the debate I wish we were having on a provincial level right now. There was another question I wanted to ask you. What's your opinion on middle density? Doug Ford has kind of come out and said uh, no fourplexes as of right in Ontario, but a lot of economists and a lot of developers like this would go a long way to helping municipalities such as yourself meet your targets without having to expand into the greenbelt.
Right.
Um, what's your opinion on that as of right across the province?
So we're actually going through this debate in Bradford right now, and it can get confused because the province has already permitted 3 units as of right.
Hmm.
I would love to permit fourplexes as of right. A resident pointed out that 3 accessory dwelling units stacked together plus one is not a fourplex. A fourplex is a purpose built, essentially small rental building. And she was essentially saying, I'm in favor of that. I'm not in favor of a basement unit, a middle unit, a top unit, and a
Right.
backyard unit. And I completely understand that point because you don't want the entire neighborhood to turn into something that's completely not what the average home buyer purchased into. But
Hmm.
I mean, I think fourplexes are a perfectly fine product. I was tagged in a Facebook chat by a group of seniors the other day, and they had a sort of it was like a back to back granny suite, and they were saying, well, why can't we build this? I'd love to be able to say you should be able to, and I think in our accessory dwelling unit permission structure, there has to be something that contemplates that. And not every backyard is going to have the space for an ADU, but in the older part of town I represent, there's a lot of laneways and a perfect place for laneway housing. There's a lot of basement apartments coming up in town. I think we're over 300-400 now that are permitted. I'm sure there's more that are unpermitted. So I think that gentle density missing middle piece needs to go into the puzzle. I also think we have an apartment building that just broke ground. I think it's 4 stories with a ground floor of retail. That's a perfect little apartment building for what is otherwise mostly a single family neighborhood. It's about I've stressed this before. It's about getting the balance right, and I think Premier Ford should have allowed for fourplexes. I know Bonnie Crombie came out in the spring and said she would, and I think the distinction is the province already allows 3 units as of right. Why not allow a purpose-built 4 unit
Hmm.
building? I take the point that 4 accessory dwelling units MacGyvered together is not exactly the same thing, but a fourplex in every residential neighborhood, it's going to go on the corner anyway, right? Someone's not going to try and shove that into. Someone's not going to buy a $1.1 million home, demolish it, and try and
Hmm.
shove a fourplex into the middle of the court. The economy wouldn't. The economies of that deal just wouldn't pencil. But buy 2 units at the corner of an existing subdivision and put up a fourplex, sure, go for it.
Well, and that's it. I mean, I'm I live in Burlington, and you go around. I think it was like 1970s. Uh, we were building that style of accommodation. The idea of being like you new young family, you rent it for a couple of years before you save up enough capital and buy a house and move out. Like
Sure.
it's like a stepping stone, right? You level up as you go, and they're perfectly fine. Like I've never seen a building that's oh geez, that's ugly. There are neighborhoods where I can tell there was a plan to kind of keep building these out over time, and we just stopped.
Yeah.
And you can tell those neighborhoods that something just stopped at that point. But I've always thought like they're not ugly buildings, and they're not. You're right. They're not built in places that you're like right next to like the big sprawling you know $3 million home. That's not where you're going to build it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and because my ward was, it's either the heritage part of town or
mhm.
the subdivisions from the 70s and 80s. In those subdivisions, they built uh, Turner Court comes to mind. It's mostly semis, and the current mayor, that was his starter home when he moved to Bradford, and he
Right.
worked his way up the property ladder. So I represent that street, and it has a special place in his heart too. You go around the corner, and it's larger single family homes. You go around another corner, and you get semis again, and it's a nice community. There's a park, and or you look at other parts of my ward. When we first were discussing fourplexes, someone said, "Well, we'd never built that in Bradford," and I just said, "Well, drive down Center Street or Scanlon Avenue. I have 4, 6, and 8 plexes, and
Hmm.
those are the rental accommodations." And the thing that I sometimes think in the province-wide, not to pick on Moffat, but the Mike Moffats of the world really are talking about this in terms of, I'll say, our generation, millennials and younger, trying to afford their first home. It's also in a neighborhood or in a community like mine, seniors looking to downsize. They might have
Right.
bought their home in the 80s for $180,000 and it's now worth 1.2 million. You'd think that would be great. But the bungalow they need to buy in town is worth 1.5 million because the bungalow is a more specialty product. And I don't have enough apartments or condos for them to downsize into yet. So
Right.
I've had a huge problem of seniors having to also drive till they qualify to afford to downsize.
My parents were in the same boat. They were looking to move out of my my childhood home, and the idea is they said, "Oh yeah, we'll find a nice rental apartment to move into." And I said, "Good luck. What are you talking about?" And they realized, yeah, it's we stopped doing that like a generation ago,
Yeah,
and whatnot. Shifting gears a bit from the provincial scene because everything is on the table apparently this month. The federal Liberal leadership
yeah.
race. I have no idea how that's going to work out, but what do you want to what are you looking to hear from the federal scene? I mean, I don't even know if we're going to have a federal government in March. That we might be going to another election. I might be calling you back to talk about the federal election. Um, but what are you and your fellow councillors looking to hear? Because we haven't really heard it much from any of the Liberal leadership candidates to replace Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, so let me do just a little throat clearing here. I'm on the board of a federal crown corporation via rail, so I got to be careful what I say about
Sure.
federal politics. And I should have said this sooner, but Bonnie Crombie, her son's my best friend, so I have a slightly inside piece into the provincial scene as well. Though I work very well with the Ford government as a councillor in a conservative riding. But all that
Mhm.
aside, I think it's going to be what I assume is going to happen is Mark Carney, I think, is the clear front runner in the race, and he, should he win, as a former central banker, will be then going up against Pierre Poilievre, who's made housing affordability and a certain easily digestible YouTube explainer video version of economics, Poilievre's calling card. He talks the game of affordability in a really clear, resonant way, and he's made it about housing and the cost of groceries. And so I actually look forward to that debate where you're going to have, perhaps from a more finance side of things in Mark Carney as the banker versus the populist politician. And the famous Apple video where the journalist calls him a populist. Probably as a populist. He
Right.
appeals to pocketbook issues and the common man. That's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It depends on what you use it for. I think that's going to be an interesting debate. A quote unquote liberal elite versus a populist conservative. But if they're both talking about finance, economics, and household budgets, let's have that debate because goodness knows there's no easy solutions for the housing affordability crisis we're in. And I also think if Carney and the other candidates, Freeland herself, have said they're not going to continue with a consumer carbon tax, and Poilievre's always been about axe the tax. Okay, let's talk about affordability once the carbon tax isn't on the table, and whether that was even the driving force behind inflation or not.
Mhm.
Economists will tell you it wasn't, but if that's off the table, we have to have a debate about all the other things that have been driving the cost of living pressures we're living under.
I guess, and that might be that's going to be the kind of final topic I want to touch upon is you've laid out an argument of what you as a municipal councilor, and I presume there are other councilors on your team that are share your thoughts on this. At the very least, the debate should be talked about in terms of how do we build housing and bring the cost of living down for not just 905, Ontario, Canada as a whole.
Right.
But that being said, we are now living under the specter of Donald Trump. And right as we're recording this, he announced that this on Saturday, basically tomorrow, he's triggering tariffs rolling tariffs on Canadian goods and whatnot. And I'm wondering, I know you're a municipal councillor, but my worry is that's going to overshadow the very important conversation that you and I just had
Right.
about tangible goods and the issues of Canadians, Ontarians, 905ers that we're going to lose. Like, we spent a year talking about this. This was the national conversation, and we're just about to throw that conversation out the door without any real solutions presented or a plan forward to address it, because we're now dealing with U.S. tariff possibly, and Donald Trump, whatever catches his eye this week.
Right.
And I kind of want to get your input on this as you're dealing with the actual issues that are dealing with that I think Canadians want dealt with. You're on the front lines of it. What's your take on this situation that we spent a year talking about it, but now all of a sudden we're just like, no, let's throw the conversation out because we're going to talk about tariffs now.
Yeah, I mean, the elephant is in the room with us in terms of the threat of tariffs, and I'm pretty worried about it in the sense of I'm an agricultural community, but we've worked really hard as well to build an industrial and kind of corporate head office industrial parks along the Highway 400 area and our existing job parks. All of that is at risk from
Mm-hmm.
if there's a 25% across the board tariff. And it's also at the risk of this is going to hurt the American economy and certainly the American consumer. Perhaps not quite as much as us because they're bigger than we are, but it's become a joke already in Washington. What does this do to lower the price of eggs? Well, it's actually going to raise the price of everything. And I don't really understand how a grown man in his late 70s can still have a kid who didn't open the textbook in first year economics seminar view of the world. It's really truly bizarre. At the municipal level, I mean, we talked about this earlier a bit. Life goes on. We have to continue to do the job and the services that people expect. And on cost of living, we've certainly tried our best. Over the past 5 budgets, we've had a tax rate on average of 2.67%, which is amongst the lowest in the province. And we've done that through some smart moves. We paid off $60 million in debt. We found a whole bunch of other efficiencies, ranging from really simple things like we standardized the point of sale devices that you use to pay at all the municipal buildings. That saved 10 grand a year. And that's a very small example, but you stack a bunch of examples like that. We sold off some surplus property for a few $1 million and used that as well. So we've been doing a bunch of really good things. On the social services side, we renovated an old public school into a community center that houses our food bank and our Out of the Cold cafe to give people those supports. At the library, when I was vice chair, we eliminated late fines because all we were seeing was it was discouraging people from coming back because they couldn't afford to pay the fine. You get rid of the fine, it actually turned out that the books came back faster anyway because it was more about wanting to use the service and not having that financial barrier. That saved families real money. So we've tried a bunch of things to put money back into people's pocket, support the most vulnerable, raising over $1 million when I was fundraising chair for the food bank. All of these things have made a real difference locally. But when you have this specter of a president who doesn't seem to understand the button he's about to press tomorrow, and we'll see if he presses it tomorrow or by the time this podcast comes out, maybe people will know. But it's always seemed like a kind of weird negotiating tactic where we don't really know what he wants, but he's whether you call it the dead cat theory, where you throw a dead cat on the negotiating table, you have to talk about the dead cat, or his Art of the Deal book that was ghostwritten for him talks a lot about you start at this maximalist position and eventually negotiate down. I have to hope that he's doing that he's starting really high, will do a bunch of things. He'll eventually feel like we've given him enough and declare victory. But it this month has felt like it's already been a year, and we have almost 4 more years of President Trump.
And I guess that's just what it comes down to is I agree. I can't imagine there are people around him who are saying, yeah, bring on the 25% tariffs. Yeah, that's going to show them. I have to believe somebody at that table is saying, this will kill us. Like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all these small towns that rely on the auto industry, sending parts down there and back and forth to build, the big three cars. They'll die.
Yeah.
There's just I can't picture these small towns being able to survive. And you're right, the price of eggs. So I sit there and say this has to be a negotiation, as you said, a negotiation tackle. It come up with the most wildly outrageous thing, and we just beg, don't, please don't. Okay, fine, we'll put more helicopters on the border for fentanyl trafficking or whatever comes across. You're right, and your point of this last month has felt like the last year, and I'm wondering, we have 4 more years of this,
Yeah.
and I'm sitting in the fact that we have kind of two elections happening in Ontario, the federal leadership, but of course now we have a provincial election. Um, we don't know what's going to happen in a month's time,
Yeah.
like in our own political backyard. What's are you concerned about that? Just like we don't know if we're going to get a new premier. We know we're going to get a new prime minister, but we don't know if, like, how what's your level of concern on this situation, just for us to be able to navigate this. Like, what new radical threat does Donald Trump want to throw at us because he doesn't like the way Niagara Falls is flowing? Who knows?
Well, listen, I get the desire from the Rust Belt voter that Trump tapped into to reshore American manufacturing jobs. But the American auto sector was built with the Auto Pact with Canada, and you had plants in Windsor or Detroit or Dayton, Ohio, and Oshawa. It's always been. He jokes about us being the 51st state. We're not, but we've always had a kind of border. What border? We're going to build these plants together. We're good friends and neighbors. The same is true. He needs Canadian oil. He needs Canadian lumber. So I don't know what he's trying to do, because for 100 years, and certainly for the last 80 years, we've had such integrated supply chains where we're the closest friends and allies. I am enough of a nerd to say we're Rohan, they're Gondor, and where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? But we'll come save you. So you know, the small northern country on top of the big massive one. Well, we've been their best friend and ally, and don't screw around with us because it's going to hurt you. And then on the provincial scene, I mean, so far the election, if I was to characterize it on day 3, Doug Ford's running against Donald Trump, who doesn't know who Doug Ford is, and Bonnie Crombie's running against Doug Ford. So we're going to see what happens here.
Right.
I lived through the election where Kathleen Wynne ran against Stephen Harper, and Tim Hudak ran against himself by saying he'd cut 100,000. I mean,
Right.
I quite like Tim Hudak. That wasn't a shot, but provincial elections often the front runner is running against somebody else, and their opposition leaders saying, "Well, hang on a minute, we're actually running against each other." So that's just a funny dynamic we have. It's really worrying. In municipal politics, I was on a panel with Mayor Marianne Mead Ward, I think you're a mayor, and
Yes.
Michelle Biot from Timmins, and we were talking about the best laid plans. Municipalities, we do everything right. Our staff put in the grant application to the feds or the province. Their staff review it. Layers of red tape and duplicated effort. You never get the money that you expected, or if you do, it's less than you wanted. There's that same dynamic here of our best laid plans. I want to revitalize my downtown this summer and tear it up and put it back together properly. I want to build a new civic center, so our town staff are in one town hall. We get a new rec center. We get a performing arts theater at the same time. We're trying to land a new hospital. I'd love to build a regional courthouse. All these big ticket infrastructure projects. On the one hand, if Donald Trump triggers this tariff war and we go into a recession, the stimulus funding that came in 2008 under Stephen Harper built my library and my leisure center. So maybe there's an opportunity at the municipal level because there'll be more capital available. The flip side is also true. People are already hurting on cost of living. I don't think people are going to want to see excess spending, but they're also going to want to see things that they've always wanted done. And they're also going to want their own household cost of living concerns taken care of. So we need clarity here one way or the other. And I don't even think we're going to get it on Saturday. He slaps the tariffs on. Are they on for a week, 10 days, 4 months, all 4 years. It's really alarming. And then, with the way the American presidential system works, their midterm elections in Congress are the next big fight. And probably by the end of June, they're effectively into those because of how long their election cycle is. So, all this to say, I wish for clarity and certainty, but we're not going to get it, even if he slaps the tariffs on, because that's probably just the start of his negotiation with us.
Yeah, you're right. I'm frustrated because I think this is the provincial election and the federal scene is the last thing we need at this moment,
Yeah,
um, as a country, as a region, as a province. But yet here we are. Um, I see we're coming up on our time. Jonathan, thank you very much for taking the time to come on and give us the perspective of you know something that we're not talking about yet in this provincial election. That's the needs of our municipalities to address what we asked them to address. Uh, so thank you very much for coming on and talking with me.
it's my pleasure. Thank you.